Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to our second Dean's Forum of the semester. As you know, this one is on a counseling topic, trauma, and you'll hear more about that in a moment. My name is Jeff Arthurs, and I'm the interim dean here at the Hamilton campus. This semester, we have 3 Dean's Forums. This is our second one. The next one is coming up pretty quick, so keep your eyes open for signing up, a lunch. And that's going to be a great lecturer and a great topic. That's Carrie Headington, who is a leading evangelist and apologist. Too much pizza. And she'll be talking about the uniqueness of Christ in this pluralistic world that we live in. Wonderful topic, necessary topic. Keep your eyes open for that. I'm going to invite Dr. Polischuk to come forward and talk about this particular event, which is the Pendleton Lecture.
Welcome to Gordon-Conwell, to the MAKO program. Initiatives to have this forum. Ray Pendleton has been a long-standing professor at Gordon-Conwell and retired. Upon his retirement, the committees got together and decided to honor him with this type of forum, the Pendleton Lectureship. Dr. Pendleton is a co-founder with myself of the MAKO program. That was 29 years ago. And he's still going strong and vibrant, and he has been a pastor, a clinician, a mentor, a big brother, a friend. We worked together for 40 years and never had any discrepancy, being so different from Maine to Patagonia, from Baptistic to Pentecostals, from very much, no nonsense to somebody that is all over the place. So we drive together. It's an honor to have this lectureship in his name. And we hope that doesn't finish here, that you keep on helping us to keep this alive and well by your participation, your donations, your prayers, your support. Thank you so much for coming. And now Dr. Pendleton will present the speaker for the day. Thank you.
Such a privilege to have you here and to have our guest today, Heather Thornburg. Heather's a wonderful background, as you know, if you looked at the poster. I know a part of her family already. She homeschooled these 3 daughters, 1 son, but the 3 daughters are triplets. And so she had them all together at once, and they're wonderful young women, and we're grateful for what they're doing. Heather is graduated from our counseling program and has served in a lot of ways, but she has this deep passion for people whose lives are broken. She has a deep spiritual insight and interest in them and knows how to have tough love, because that's what really required in the program, and she'll talk about it. She has been the program director and initiator of Amirah House for the last 4 years, but her vision doesn't stop there, and perhaps she'll tell us a little bit more about how they're expanding now to dealing with this particular difficult-to-treat population into Connecticut. She always has a vision for how this can be greater, how this can be broader. Heather is a really gifted person, a gifted clinician with deep insights, a deep love for Christ, and understanding how to pull together her faith and minister to people in a wonderful and gracious and loving way, and at the same time hold strong boundaries. This is not an easy task. She's an expert at that. So it's a privilege for us to have Heather here, and I know as you listen to her heart, you'll understand why she's so good at what she does. Heather, thank you for being with us.
Sure. Lots of pizza still here. Feel free to get up and move about.
Good afternoon. I have to admit I'm a little nervous, and as I was thinking about that today, because that's not normal for me when I speak, I realize that there's a couple reasons for that. And one is that it is an honor to be here at my alma mater and to speak before you because I know the individuals, the caliber of who you are, seeking an education at Gordon-Conwell. And so I'm very humbled as well as honored to stand before you today. The second reason is that I'm very passionate about what I'm going to talk about. I think that it is critically important that Christian leaders have an understanding of trauma. And I want to talk a little bit more about why that is and what trauma is. That's really what I'm hoping to share with you today is an understanding, an introduction to the issue of trauma so that you can recognize it and you can begin to identify the behaviors in the people that you serve. So I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about myself. I am the Chief Program Officer at Amirah, and Amirah is an organization that offers aftercare services to women who've been victims of sex trafficking domestically. As you can see on the slide, we strive to provide a refuge for those seeking to break free from exploitation and heal in community on their journey towards lasting hope. The things that these women face make that very simple definition a monumental task. The way that we do this is through a long-term, whole-person, individualized, trauma-informed program. It's a lot of qualifiers, so let me break it down. Whole person means that everything we do, we've identified 6 categories of care of a human being, and everything that we do with the women designing their program and working on their recovery is seen through that lens of physical, social, emotional, psychological, vocational, and spiritual recovery. Long-term means that a woman can be with us approximately 2 years. We don't have a solid end date because every woman's journey is different. And so a woman that has been through sex trafficking needs an extensive amount of time to recover, and that is very difficult to find within our current mental health system. And so Amirah wants to fill that gap. And then trauma-informed is what we're going to be talking about today. So I graduated in 2013, so it hasn't been too long ago. And when I was here, I can recall that more than once I heard from MDiv students of some variation of the following. My calling is to preach, so I won't be doing much counseling. Now, my father was a pastor. I love that little rumble of, oh my. My father was a pastor, and I have literally spent my entire life in church leadership in one form or another. And I cannot think of a ministry position that I have ever observed or ever been a part of where an individual would not be called upon to counsel people in some capacity. By virtue of the fact that you are identified as a Christian leader, a pastor or minister, you will be at the very least sought out for advice for difficult and thorny problems. You might also be considered a counselor, advocate, and companion to those who are struggling. Because of this fact, my jumping off point for this presentation today is Galatians 6:2. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. I consider this verse a good explanation of what I do every day. But growing up and later as an adult, I saw this verse misused. In some cases, I saw it used by individuals as a demand upon leadership, you're supposed to help me. And in other cases, as a reason why Christians, particularly Christian leaders, shouldn't say no to requests for help if their calling was true. In order to put the call to burden bearing into perspective, especially as it relates to working with those who have a background of trauma or are in the midst of traumatic experiences, I want to look at some contextual features of the verse. You're used to this, right? So Paul is writing to a group of churches that have had Judaizers come into their congregations preaching a new gospel. And this new gospel says that in order to be saved, and in addition to faith in Christ, you must be circumcised. According to the language of Galatians, this ticked Paul off. In his letter, Paul contrasts the law of Moses with the law of Christ, and he finds the cross superior to the law, and it is all that is necessary for salvation. As I read Galatians, I understand Paul is presenting this issue of Judaizing as an issue of power and control, not an issue of faith. Paul turns the caste system of the ancient world on its head when he writes in Galatians 3:28, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." Each of these three comparisons represents a major power dynamic that Paul's audience was intimately familiar with. And Paul says, because of Christ, these power dynamics no longer exist at the foot of the cross. So with these distinctions of the flesh removed, Paul turns to discussing in chapter 5 who they are in Christ and gives a picture of what their lives in Christ look like: freedom and the fruit of the Spirit. And this life of freedom is only possible because of the cross of Christ, not by any work of the flesh. So finally, in chapter 6, Paul turns to summing up all that has been said. And thus the weight of meaning of Galatians 6:2 is carrying is that through faith in Christ, we are saved, and we live equally under the law of Christ in freedom and by the Spirit. And only after immersing ourselves in the freedom of Christ by faith, and only after tasting the fruit of the Spirit, are we called to bear any burdens. Burden bearing is an outflow of the gospel we have experienced. And it is only possible because of the cross and the equality of the believers. So burden bearing is a two-way street, even for Christian leaders. And I will talk more about this later in my presentation. So understanding our call as burden bearers is the starting point, but there are some burdens that require specific and informed bearing. Turning back to what I heard from some MDiv students during my time here at the seminary, I want to reflect on why it is necessary for Christian ministers to understand trauma. In 1997, and I realized that that was an old study, the Journal of Clinical Psychiatry published a literature review that found that most Americans experience at least one trauma over the course of their lives. While that is an old study, ask yourselves, do you think that that number has increased or decreased, or the amount of trauma that individuals in the world or our nation or our state or our cities are experiencing? Think about your own experience. How many people do you know or have you met that have experienced a traumatic event? Keep that question in your mind. In order to put the finding of this literature review into context, we need to consider what trauma is. Now beware, this is where I go off script. I teach on trauma as an introduction many times, so I am doing this by my experience. So let's start with the definition of what trauma is. Trauma is an event or series of events that involves actual or threatened harm that places overwhelming demands on the body system and results in the person experiencing intense fear or helplessness. I'd like to break this down to a few elements that I think are critically important. Number one, an event or series of events. If you encounter a person that's had a single trauma, you need to take that just as seriously as someone that's had chronic trauma in their life. Number two, actual or threatened harm. Trauma, the effect of trauma and whether a traumatic event has happened is not assessed by your observation. It is assessed by the perception of the individual that has been traumatized. And I will tell you that threatened trauma can be just as, if not more harmful, and have more impact than actual trauma. And finally, the piece that I want to pull out is overwhelming demands on the body system. And this is where I think it gets interesting. And this is where a lot of current research on trauma is being done. And that is the fact that trauma begins in our bodies. And it takes place outside of our conscious control. And the easiest way to think about this is the human stress response, what we know as fight or flight. So think about this. All of you came here today by some means, maybe a car, and you certainly all have had the experience of driving in the state of Massachusetts. So I am going to assume that you have had some experience where in traffic you've had a moment of fear. You've been cut off. What happens in your body when you're cut off in traffic? What are some of the symptoms that you might experience? Maybe sweaty palms, rapid heart rate, trouble breathing, muscle tension. You might cry out. And what is your response? You might slam on the brake. At least I hope you do. Do you tell yourself, oh, wait a minute, I'm in trouble. I need to take my foot off the accelerator, and I'm now going to cram it on the brake as hard as I can? We don't do that. It happens like that, and it happens outside of our control. And that is the result of the stress response system in the human body working. When that stress response is triggered, there is a cascade of chemicals that takes place in the body. Number one is adrenaline. That is the chemical that allows you to make that split-second decision to cram on the brake and keep yourself safe. Then there's cortisol, which is another stress hormone that mediates the effect of adrenaline in the system so that when you need it, it's there. Then there is natural opiates. Our body expresses natural painkillers. Have you ever heard somebody talk about breaking a major bone and they didn't feel it at first? How can that be? It's because our body is taking care of you. And finally, the last one I'll mention is serotonin. That is a neurotransmitter that is also designed to mediate the effect of these other chemicals in the body. Now, I don't know about you, but I have triplets. And I have a deep understanding of the power and the impact of hormones. They are real, and they are powerful, and they shape and change the body and the brain. Now let's talk a little bit. Oh, before I move on, I want to mention one more thing. If the stress response gets triggered chronically over and over, it can start to go haywire, and it can start to be triggered at non-stressful or non-traumatic events. So let's talk a little bit about what some of the expressions of the stress response you might observe in an individual. So we have fight, flight, or freeze, and these are the common responses. So in the fight category, you might see somebody who's aggressive. Aggressive in their posture, aggressive in their tone and their words. Irritability or anger. Trouble concentrating. That's a really interesting one. Why would that be there? I heard it explained this way. First of all, if you are feeling in trouble and your survival instinct kicks in through the stress response and you're looking for the exits and you're assessing people who are safe or unsafe, are you going to be able to recall very well your 8 times tables? Why not? Well, if my fist represents the hind portion of the brain, the part in the back of the skull, this is where our automatic reflexes are stored, and this is where our emotions are stored. My other hand represents the executive function of our brain. That is the brain in front, and this is where we make decisions, this is where we reason, and this is where logic resides. When the stress response is triggered, this goes offline. And all that's operating is this, because it is automatically there to take care of you and keep you safe. On the flight category, these are very obvious, and you can identify with these, I'm sure. People who avoid, or people who withdraw or seek out solitude in order to protect themselves. And finally, we have the freeze category. This is people who shut down, seeking out ways to numb your experience. Do you know what a great way to numb is? Heroin. We have an opiate crisis that I'm sure you've heard of in our region, and that is one of the things that we have to contend with in almost every single woman that comes into our program. Opiates have kept her safe to a certain extent. They have allowed her to numb the very difficult circumstances and experiences that she has had to survive. But now she is left with the effect of this malignant numbing process. Submission. This is the person that might say, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, or apologize all the time. I'm sorry, I'm sorry. Tuning out. Spacey. Overcompliant. The person that is looking to figure out what you need before you need it so that you don't get angry with them. They're trying to circumvent trouble. So I'd also like to look at the category of complex trauma, which is a subcategory of trauma in the mental health profession. So as we consider this, why is it necessary to look at complex trauma? Well, let me give you the definition. Complex trauma happens when you've had a single traumatic event as a child, or you've had a series of traumatic events as an adult. Why do you think there's a difference between those two? A single traumatic event as a child has just as profound an effect on an individual as a series of traumatic events as an adult.
in terms of the mental, emotional, spiritual, physical, belief.
The key is development. That's right. So let me explain that. I have a question for you. Show of hands. How many of you checked your closet for monsters last night? Why not? Because you're all adults, and your understanding of the world tells you that the chances of monsters living in your closet is very, very low. But what if you're a 5-year-old? You have an active imagination because that is appropriate to your development stage, and you are convinced that there is a family of monsters that lives in your closet, and you can tell what they look like and what they're wearing, and you have to check on them every night before you go to bed to make sure that you're okay. What happens if that particular 5-year-old has a traumatic event happen in their life? The existence of monsters has been confirmed. And forever after, that traumatic event will begin to shape and impact the way that they see and understand the world. So complex trauma is very important to understand. So let's look at what the symptoms of that are. So number 1, difficulty regulating affect and impulses. Now, affect is a technical term, and what that means is the outer expression of an internal emotion. So if you're happy, you might smile. If you're sad, you frown. There's something about affect that I find very interesting, and that is the fact it can be socially constructed. We have expectations in certain social situations that people will express and show certain emotions within the context of our expectations. And so an easy way to think about this is funerals, grieving. If you go to a funeral in our culture, my culture, white American culture, what do you expect to see? Perhaps crying, sadness, expressed by hushed tones, quiet reflection. Now, in another culture, you might see something different. I've never been to an Irish wake, but I hear they're rather raucous. The expectation of affect for that environment is very different than the first one that I explained. So in some ways, affect is socially constructed. I realized this the first time I was standing in Starbucks, with a very crowded Starbucks with one of the women from our home, and she was telling me something deeply personal and deeply traumatic that had happened to her, and she was doing it at full volume. And there was a part of me, and I'm glad I didn't do this, but there was a part of me that wanted to say, shh, because I could tell the people around us were hearing and were very uncomfortable. But this particular woman had no conception of that because all of her energy and all of her internal resources were going to managing what she was telling me and managing what was on the inside. So she was not connected with what someone else might be thinking or feeling. Difficulty controlling affect and impulses. Number 2, alterations in attention or consciousness. And if you reflect on the fight or flight response, the freeze aspect has elements of this. Number 3 is somatization. Now, this is another big giant technical term that we use, and what this means is a physical expression of a psychological pain or a psychological experience. An easy way to think of this is test anxiety. I hope no one here has it because I've taken some tests here. But if you do and you are preparing for a large test, what are some physical symptoms that you might be experiencing? Nausea, muscle tension, perhaps headache, muscle pain, hot and cold sweats, difficulty with memory. Now, think about that. You're sick to your stomach, you have muscle pain, and you have hot and cold sweats. That sounds like you have the flu. Do you have the flu? No. You have test anxiety. There is no biological origin for the physical symptoms you're expressing or experiencing. That is somatization. And with a person who has complex trauma, they frequently are not able to make the connection between their physical pain and their psychological pain. All they know is that they have chronic pain and they've been to multiple doctors and they've had multiple treatments and they've tried multiple medications. No one can figure out what's wrong, and they continue to be in pain. Number 4, alterations in self-perception, the way I see and understand myself. That same woman that was in Starbucks was the very first woman that we ever brought into our safe home. And when I interviewed her, I met her the first time, I asked her a simple question, or what I thought was a simple question. I said, "Tell me about yourself." And her response to me was, "I'm just a junkie and a hoe." Now, as a Christian person, I knew that she was created in the image of God, and her value was incalculable. But the way that she understood and saw herself had been deeply impacted by the experiences that she had gone through. I've known her now for 4 years. She's graduated from our program. We continue to serve her and help her. She's doing terrific. She has worked incredibly hard to move away from that assessment of herself. It takes a lot of work. Number 5, interpersonal difficulties. This makes a lot of sense. If you are struggling with your affect and you're not connected with what people around you are experiencing, if you have chronic pain, if you sometimes space out when people are trying to talk to you, if you don't see yourself as a valuable person with something to contribute, of course you're going to have interpersonal difficulties. And that's something that we have to account for. We have to teach the women that have gone through this how to have conflict, how to connect with each other. That's why in our mission statement we say healing in community, because it's only through that experience are they able to begin to recover from this kind of symptom. And finally, disrupted systems of meaning. When I first started at Amirah, I was asked to read a memoir called Girls Like Us. It was written by a survivor, and she now has an outreach program on the streets of New York City. And in this book, she recalls sitting and talking with a 14-year-old girl who was in the midst of actively being trafficked. And this young lady told her, "I know my daddy loves me." Now, Rachel, the survivor, knew that her daddy was actually her pimp. But she asked her, "How do you know that your daddy loves you?" And her response was, "Well, after he beats me, he buys me cheese doodles and chocolate milk, and he knows those are my favorite." Can we say that her system of meaning of love has been disrupted? I would say it's been blown out of the water. How much work and how much time and how much assistance is that young lady going to need in order to come back to a healthy and whole understanding of what love is? So knowing a bit more about what trauma is, do you think you might be called upon to work with someone that has experienced trauma? Traumatic experiences can lead to a multitude of mental health disorders, many of which you will see in your ministry if you know what to look for. However, the category of mental health disorders that trauma frequently leads to are the anxiety disorders, and this includes post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. With this category of anxiety disorders in mind, trauma-informed spiritual care must recognize the pervasive effects of traumatic experiences on an individual's life and behavior, on their perceptions of themselves and their bodies, and on their relationship with each other. This constellation of effects is known as biopsychosocial. Psychologists love to make up words. That makes a lot of sense, right? Biopsychosocial. Yarhouse, Buttman, and McRae are Christian psychologists, and they have a book called Modern Psychopathologies. And in this book, they say, our biological vulnerability to psychopathologies reflects our fallen condition. So it is important for Christians to take the brain and the nervous system seriously. With the possible exception of the phobias, all of the stress and anxiety disorders have been shown to be connected to biological vulnerabilities. Jones and Buttman speak of the risks of offering a disembodied understanding of persons in working with troubled persons, in other words, a mind without a body. Problems of anxiety are undoubtedly a biopsychosocial phenomenon. So you can see, trauma-informed spiritual care recognizes the effects of trauma on an individual biologically, psychologically, and socially. In his classic book on community called Life Together, Dietrich Bonhoeffer comes at it another way. He says, to bear the burden of the other person means involvement with the created reality of the other, to accept and affirm it, and in bearing with it, to break through to the point where we take joy in it. Did everybody take joy in their created reality this morning? Some days I do, some days I don't. So if the problem of trauma is biopsychosocial in nature, then the remedy must also be biopsychosocial. Does your parishioner need a mental health professional in addition to your assistance? Or maybe they need medication to relieve symptoms. or maybe they just need an attentive listener, or maybe they need all three. I'd like to take a moment and talk about medication. In my experience, in fact, I was a person that resisted medication because of my, at that time, understanding that, I just need to rely on God to deal with my depression and deal with my anxiety. And fortunately, I had a good Christian counselor that encouraged me to consider that there might be some biological vulnerabilities that I was experiencing. My view of medication, mental health medications, is that they are not designed to cure symptoms. They are designed to free up resources internally so that an individual has the opportunity and the energy to be able to learn new coping skills, take on board new habits, so that they can better address the symptoms of depression and anxiety and other mental health systems that come up. I will also say that some medications are lifelong because some mental health disorders do have biological origins. So trauma-informed spiritual care, secondly, should seek to prioritize physical, psychological, and emotional safety for all involved, and this includes those who are working with the individual. In your ministry, develop a policy about how you and your team will respond should someone on your team feel physically unsafe, as well as what to do if a parishioner is not safe. These are thorny issues. To do this, I recommend that you make contact with local organizations that are already doing some of this work. Like I was speaking with someone ahead of time. There's an organization locally called HAWK that works to advocate for women, particularly women who've been caught up in domestic violence. Hagar Sisters is another organization locally that does that good work. And they already have been thinking about this. So contact them and partner with them as you're thinking about how you are going to operate in this way to keep yourself and your team safe. I also encourage you to develop a relationship with your local police department so that you know them and they know you, and when you need to call them, you are free and able to do so. Emotional safety means taking care of yourself and your team, and I want to go into this in a little more in depth in a moment. One of the most important issues of safety to account for is relational safety. In a word, this means confidentiality. I look at it this way. Every person's story belongs to them, and no one has the right to share that story without their permission. You also have an ethical and professional obligation to observe strict confidentiality, and there are very real consequences if you do not do so. In my own life, when I was a young mother, remember I had triplets, I also had some issues. My husband and I had called on our local church where we attended. They had a pastoral care ministry. And so we both were utilizing the services of this ministry as we were trying to navigate parenthood with all these pressures and obligations, as well as our own baggage. And so my husband was seeing the director of the ministry, and I was seeing a graduate level intern. And one night, I was experiencing a crisis, and I really needed to talk to somebody, and my counselor was unavailable. So I reached out, and the director of the program, who was also seeing my husband, agreed to meet with me. And in this conversation, as I was sharing with him the things that were concerning me, he started telling me things that I needed to do and things that I needed to stop doing. And I couldn't put my finger on it, but it felt really icky. There was something about what he was saying to me that just was very uncomfortable. And I was disturbed when I left, and I went home and I told my husband what had happened. A couple days later, he came to me and he said, "Heather, I didn't want to say anything at first because I didn't want to hurt you, but the things that he was bringing up in your meeting with him, I had brought up in my meeting with him." That was unethical. He had betrayed my husband's confidence by sharing things even though he didn't identify it, and he'd betrayed me by not being honest with me about where this information was coming from. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back for me. There had been other things that had happened, but that was the point when I said, forget it, I'm out of church. And I left church for 2 years, and that's the first time and only time in my life that I have been out of church. And that was the breaking point for me. So there are very real consequences to not observing confidentiality. Cultivate a culture of confidentiality. In doing so, become familiar with the very important reasons for and ways to break confidentiality. And here I'm speaking of mandated reporting. If in your work you ever come across a child, elderly person, or disabled person who's at risk for harm, abuse, or neglect, you have an obligation to report that. And become familiar with the agencies that you need to do that. Next, trauma-informed spiritual care seeks to help an individual take their place within the community of Christ. Again, Yarhouse, Butman, and McRae says, the theme of social networks runs throughout the literature on stress and anxiety disorders. Without social support, we just do not cope well. With it, we have the potential to be more resilient. Learning how to face our fears and anxiety together, not just alone, can make all the difference in the world. If Paul's letters to the churches are to be believed, then the fellowship of the believers is the outflow of the gospel. Is it any wonder then that the same fellowship is a mark of good mental health? And finally, develop a list of local and trusted mental health resources. This is a necessary component to your trauma-informed spiritual care because you cannot meet all of the presenting needs yourself. Don't even try. The final point of trauma-informed spiritual care leads us to this discussion I alluded to in my summary of Galatians 6:2. Burden bearing is a two-way street. If we are equal before the cross, and because you will be called upon in your ministry to bear many individuals' burdens, you must find those partners who will help you bear your burdens. Let me say that again. Get help. There's a phenomenon in the helping professions that we call vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue. This phenomenon occurs when compassionate people who desire to help others become burdened with the weight of traumatic stories and symptoms in the people they care for. Just as speaking out a traumatic experience in a safe and caring environment is beneficial and necessary for healing to begin in a person that's coming to you, you also need a safe space to speak out how those stories impact you. Working with traumatized people is difficult and exhausting work. So get help. What kind of help do you need? First, find a counselor or spiritual director. I have both and a professional supervisor. I need a whole team of people in order to keep going and do the job that I do. You may not have a diagnosed mental health condition, but if you are working with traumatized individuals, you need healthy, safe, and educated counsel where you can unburden yourself. Next, develop and commit to a personal boundaries, even when those in your care object. Determine how accessible you are to your congregation in a way that makes sense for you and your family, and determine how much rest you require to function well. Make these boundaries known and stick to them. If you have people in immediate crisis, tend to them. But follow that up with the rest or relaxation that you need in order to recover. This recovery may require that you work with your staff to support each other. At Amirah, we have a written policy on rest and Sabbath that I want to share with you. It includes the following elements. First of all, an expectation that we only work the hours we've been hired for, and when our job is done, we will rest from work. What a concept. One day a week, all Amirah communication is shut off as a day of Sabbath is taken. Next, our first priority is to God. Our second is to each other as staff, as our work is impossible to bear alone. In order to sustain our work, we support each other before we can support the program participants. Next, if we do work overtime for some reason, and it happens, we take compensation time off as soon as possible. And finally, we extend grace to those who are on duty for whatever decision they make in difficult circumstances. We don't second guess them. We instituted this policy a couple of years ago, and when we did, it was as if the staff breathed a sigh of relief. Since we began practicing this policy, we have experienced increased team cohesion and increased energy in the very difficult work we do. The demand didn't change, but how we addressed that demand did change for the better. If you desire to avoid burnout, write out your own policy of rest and Sabbath for you and for your team and stick to it. Make sure that your team is functioning in the same way so you don't burn them out. Finally, find a way to deeply connect with the reality that when we bear another's burden, it is for the purpose of delivering it to the foot of the cross. It is not for us to solve that burden or make it go away. We can't do that. The law of Christ is the cross, and in it we find the power for healing. Christian philosopher Os Guinness, in his book Unspeakable, Facing Up to the Challenge of Evil, states, "In the crucifixion of Jesus, sheer and unadulterated evil meets sheer and unadulterated love. And unadulterated love wins out over evil. No one can ever go so low that God in Jesus has not gone lower. The horrendous evil that looks as if it is the final obliteration of goodness and humanness becomes God's deepest identification with his creatures. There is hope for victims. There is even forgiveness for perpetrators. I guarantee that in your ministry, you will hear stories of trauma that will challenge your faith. I do every day. And do you think I always know how to respond? No. But if I am connected to the cross, and I am assured that Jesus is present with the person in front of me, whether they know it or not, I can say, I do not know the answer for you, but I will stand before the cross with you to seek the answer from the crucified Christ, and I will wait with you until that answer comes. Bonhoeffer states, therefore, the Bible can also characterize the whole life of the Christian as bearing the cross. It is the fellowship of the cross to experience the burden of the other. So to review, trauma-informed spiritual care recognizes the effects of trauma on the individual, its biological, social, and psychological effects. Trauma-informed spiritual care seeks to provide an environment of safety for all concerned, including those who are working with individuals. It seeks to walk side by side with the individual and assist them to build a system of support and help them find their place in the community of Christ. And it recognizes when outside help is needed. And burden bearing is a two-way street. Find a counselor or spiritual director. Develop and commit to personal boundaries. Write out that policy of rest and Sabbath. And finally, connect to the cross. I hope today that I've been able to give you a better understanding of trauma and how it might look in your ministry, as well as give you some tools to help you contend with this issue, both personally and corporately. Most importantly, I hope that I have stood in the shadow of the cross as I've shared these things with you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heather. Terrific information. Thanks for taking a lot of theory and a lot of synthesis and putting the cookies on the shelves for us today. We have Q&A. We have microphones that are available. Daniel has a couple. Just raise your hand. He will bring you a mic. Would you please stand and state your question? And we will go until 1:15 with Q&A.
I have a question about counseling someone who has suicidal thoughts. And I have a friend who is counseled to share that with someone. And so she shares it, and then she's in college, the RA, she told the authorities because she was concerned for her. The police show up, and she's not willing to go with them. So then she's arrested, and she's embarrassed and shamed in handcuffs. Gets arrested. They're calling medical, the facility people and everything. And now she wants to drop out of college because she feels so shamed. Mm-hmm. And so how do you counsel someone to open up and share your struggle of suicide and depression if it's going to be met by people who don't know how to respond accordingly?
Well, remember the priority is to keep people safe. And so if there is somebody that is actively suicidal, you need to call the authorities, even if they're going to be angry with you. That's hard to do. But you can also do safety planning with somebody who is experiencing suicidal thoughts. And there are, you can talk to the professors in the MACO department here and get some good resources on that. But you work through with a person, if you're feeling this way, where are you going to be? Who are you going to reach out to? What are you going to do to take care of yourself? And you put that together. And then if they do happen to get involved in the system, then you walk through that with them as much as they allow you to. Unfortunately, there's not many good answers to somebody that is actively suicidal in order to keep them safe, and that becomes a traumatic event, but it's a traumatic event that can be recovered from if they're alive.
Heather, thank you
Yes.
so much. My name is Dan. You had said towards the beginning of your talk that sometimes threatened trauma can be as bad as actual trauma or even worse. Could you educate further on how that looks and how is that so?
Well, that's particularly true. I think of the context that I work in with the women that I work with, and that is one of the ways that they are controlled. And all it takes is one beating for a person to be afraid when it's being threatened again, and that fear factor can start to go up exponentially whether that person gets touched or not. And again, it's about development as well. Depending on the stage of development that a person is in when they are threatened, will have different impact on that person. Because you think about it, an adult has some control over their life. They have some more resources to figure out how to get out of a situation that's threatening, but a child does not, or a teenager does not. I hope that begins to address it. I mean, any of these questions, all I can do is kind of like touch it, and then that's it.
You mentioned that when somebody comes to you for help, and maybe the correct answer for you is just to tell he or her, the only thing we can do is to stay with Jesus Christ and on the shadow of Christ. But how would you or shall we respond if the person feel a bit disappointed with this answer? Kind of, how about if the client feels that's a very helpless answer from...
When I was in school here, I took a course with Dr. Mason called Ministry to Women in Pain. And one of the things that I learned there was a very powerful concept, and that's the ministry of presence. Simply being faithful to stand with a person, even in their disappointment, is effective and powerful. And this is borne out in the secular psychological culture. I find this interesting, but there are studies that have been done trying to evaluate what sort of therapeutic intervention works best. And what they find is that they all work approximately equally. And the common denominator is the therapeutic relationship. The relationship is where the power to change comes from and the power to heal comes from. And as Christians, whether we're working with Christians or not, our relationship is a reflection of the desire that God has to have fellowship with us. And so continuing to stand with a person, there's something very powerful in saying, I don't know the answer. But you can also declare, you have been sinned against. It was wrong. You should not have experienced that. And sometimes just saying that can really deeply impact a person because they feel heard and they feel seen, maybe for the first time.
Is it always appropriate to wait until they bring up God or the supernatural or an open universe concept instead of their closed universe concept, which understandably would keep them in bondage and in trouble?
In my opinion, that depends on the position that you have. You're wearing a collar, Wendy. Yeah. So if someone comes to you, the issue of God has just been brought up. So your position is very different, and that can be a jumping off point for you. The job that I had before Amirah was at a local generalist clinic where people would just come in to seek counseling. I didn't bring that up. But I'll tell you what I did do. There was an extra chair in my office, and in that chair, Jesus sat. And I saw him. And everything that I said went through him to the person, and everything the person said went through him to me. And that was my prayer. And I was able to affirm Christ in that individual without using, spiritual language. And you're not going to always be able to come to the point where you can talk about spiritual things, but you as a Christian can bring the presence of Christ into that moment. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you, folks. We'll see you again on November 5th for the next Dean's Forum. Carrie Headington presenting the uniqueness of Christ in a pluralistic world. Shall we pray together? Gracious Father, I pray that you will help us by the power and presence of your Spirit, by the model and the presence of your Son, Jesus, to bear one another's burdens. In his name we pray, amen.